Welcome to Books of Our Time, produced by the Massachusetts School of Law and seen nationwide. Today we shall discuss The Limits of Power, a book about American foreign and military policy, and even more fundamentally, about American government and the American way of life. Its author, who is with us today, is Andrew Bacevich, a former professional military officer who is a professor of international relations and history at Boston University. And I am Lawrence R. Velvel, the Dean of the Massachusetts School of Law. Before I begin the questioning, I would like to make a more elaborate introductory statement about this book, which is the third one by Professor Bacevich to be discussed here. The Limits of Power is, in my opinion, either the single most important or one of the two most important books of the approximately 120 or more discussed over the years on this program. Professor Bacevich believes, and explains why he believes, that our national security policies have been significantly misdirected for about 60 to 70 years, the flaming materialism that has caused this misdirection, and the fecklessness of the presidents and the Congresses that have pursued it. He thinks, with ample supporting argument, that George Bush's views were in significant part a continuation of the past, not a break with it, as both Bush and his critics believed. And I think it likely that he feels policies under President Obama could in many respects be the same and ultimately unsustainable. His book should be taken to heart by every person in Washington, yet almost surely won't be. And that way may lie ultimate tragedy. Andy, thank you for coming up from BU. I normally don't make statements like this at the beginning of a program, but I do think your book is so important that I thought I would make it so that to try to encourage people as much as I can. And I think I hope this program will also encourage them to read the book. It's not very long. It's about 230 pages, if I remember.
Yeah, it's short.
Andy, as we left off the last time, you had just come to the point where you mentioned Forrestal having come to office as the Secretary of Defense upon the retirement of Henry Stimson, who once said, "Gentlemen, do not read other people's mail," and the different kind of a personality that Forrestal had. And I'm sure you were about to point out the differences made in policy when Forrestal was there and his progeny, because Forrestal begat Nitze, who begat Wolfowitz, and so forth. So why don't you continue on in that vein?
Well, again, Stimson, a man of sober judgment. Forrestal, somebody who tended to inflate threats, assume the worst.
Inflate threats, assume the worst.
And insist on a militarized solution as the best way to defend against the threat that he saw. And in the book I try to describe...
Are you talking about Iraq now? I'm just kidding.
Yeah. I mean, in the book I try to describe him as the first of a new breed of national security expert. And I think I describe his, in a sense, successor. I don't mean successor as Secretary of Defense, but somebody cut from the same cloth who continues the Forrestal style as Paul Nitze, very famous as the author of a document called NSC 68, which is really one of the foundational documents of the U.S. strategy in the Cold War. And I think in many respects one of Nitze's successors, again not in terms of position but in terms of mindset, would be Paul Wolfowitz, who by the time we get to the post 9/11 period has risen to a position of great influence. And again, I think had this tendency to overstate threats, to exaggerate danger, to be unwillingness to accept risk, and to insist that the solution to our national security problems lies in the aggressive use of military power. So there is a mindset or a set of common assumptions that tends to pervade influential members of the national security elite, beginning with Forrestal. And I don't mean that these people have bad intentions or that they view themselves as honorable servants of the state who are trying to do what they think is right. But in my own judgment, in in recurrent ways, they get things fundamentally wrong, and rather than contributing to our security, actually undermine it.
Yes, it's what I consider a lawyeristic kind of thinking. If X then Y, if Y then Z, and this, and you point out that they understate the benefits of doing nothing. We would have been much better off doing nothing in Vietnam, because all the claims of what would ultimately, that all proved to be untrue.
Right.
That proved to be untrue.
They failed to consider the possibility of letting time solve the problem, and they also failed to gauge accurately the consequences, the unintended consequences of using force. So they imagine that force can provide a economical and politically effective solution to a problem, when history, I think, would tell us that even if force is necessary at times, and it is, that almost always the use of force gives rise to unintended consequences, and it's almost always far more costly than the advocates of force are willing to acknowledge. The Iraq War being a perfect example. It's now the second most expensive war in our country history, second only to World War II. And the truth is, we're not anywhere close to seeing the last bill. It's already a $1 trillion war. It's probably going to be a $2 trillion war.
Right. I wasn't really kidding when I said it sounded like Iraq, because it was all the same arguments that you're talking about that recurred in Iraq. Can you tell people very briefly? You mentioned NSC 68, and in the book you point out this was the first time that, quote, the facts were fixed around the policy.
Right.
Want to explain what NSC 68 was briefly, and how the facts were fixed around the policy?
Sure. It's called NSC 68. It was a document prepared for consideration by the National Security Council. The numbering simply reflects the numbering system that was in effect at the time. The context is this. After the Soviet bomb goes off in August, on October 1st of 1949, the communists come to power in the People's Republic of China. So we've got these two seem to be, at the time, they're not insignificant events, but at the time they seem to be earthquakes. We've lost our monopoly on nuclear weapons, and now here the most populous country in the world has slipped into the communist camp. This causes, within the Truman administration, an effort to reassess basic U.S. policy.
The American people desire and are determined to work for a world in which all nations and all peoples are free to govern themselves as they see fit, and to achieve a decent and satisfying life. Above all else, our people desire and are determined to work for peace on earth, a just and lasting peace, based on genuine agreement, freely arrived at by equals. In the pursuit of these aims, the United States and other like-minded nations find themselves directly opposed by a regime with contrary aims and a totally different concept of life. That regime adheres to a false philosophy which purports to offer freedom, security, and greater opportunity to mankind. Misled by that philosophy, many peoples have sacrificed their liberties, only to learn to their sorrow that deceit and mockery, poverty and tyranny are their reward. That false philosophy is communism. Our allies are the millions who hunger and thirst after righteousness. Steadfast in our faith in the Almighty, we will advance toward a world where man's freedom is secure. To that end, we will devote our strength, our resources, and our firmness of resolve. With God's help, the future of mankind will be assured in a world of justice, harmony, and peace.
Paul Nitze, at the time, is the director of the policy planning staff in the State Department, and it's his task to take the lead in drafting this document, and is the principal author. What the document is, again, this is a document available on the internet. Google NSC 68 comes right up. Unfortunately, it's pretty long, but it is genuinely worth citizens rereading. And what you get here is, in NSC 68, is what's clearly a wildly exaggerated depiction of the military threat posed by the Soviet Union, a deeply ideological interpretation of their policies that pays no attention to Soviet national security interests. And an analysis that basically says to the National Security Council, and by extension to President Truman, there's only three courses of action. And the first course of action is preventive war, which NHTSA says we would never do, although of course we have since.
Can I interrupt something? I want to combine some things here. Preventive war, you point out, that was the Bush theory for going into Iraq. Right. You point out, unknown to most people. De facto, we rejected that when we did not fight a preventive war against Russia.
Absolutely.
Yeah, and indeed, Bobby Kennedy, one of the reasons we didn't invade Cuba, there were several, was that he said this would be Pearl Harbor all over again, us fighting a preventive war against Cuba. Well, go ahead.
Okay. So NHTSA's analysis says, well, one option is we could simply launch a nuclear attack against the Soviet Union. We can't do that. That would be wrong. The other option is we can completely revert to an isolationist posture. Well, we can't do that. And therefore, the only option that's left is the one that I want, which is advocating rearmament and the development of the hydrogen bomb.
Yeah.
And the point is that it is such a fraudulent kind of analysis, and frankly does such a disservice to the decision makers. To present President Truman with dumb option number one, dumb option number two, and then plausible option number three, really removes the decision-making authority from the president and puts it in the hands of the staffer who drafted this memo. And I think that it's worth seeing that technique displayed in NSC 68, because that's not going to be the last time that kind of bureaucratic game
Don't you in effect say in the book that that's the kind of option that was presented to George Bush with Iraq, because de facto what happened, you call it a non-decision decision, if I remember correctly, and it was driven by a small group of people, just like at the time of NSC 68, and for that matter at the XCOM and the Cuban Missile Crisis. The whole thing has gotten into the hands of small groups of people who are making these decisions, and they're not always, sometimes the recommendations are stupid, and sometimes they're simply not giving the president the full range of possibilities.
I'm not sure we know when and how the decision to invade Iraq was made. I mean, we can say, in the case of NSC 68, that there is an identifiable paper trail. We can identify the date when President Truman met with the National Security Council and discussed this. We know what was said and we know what decision was rendered. What's happened since 1950 is that decision-making in 1950 is relatively formal. What's happened since 1950 is that the decision-making has become ever less formal, and the number of people in the room making the decision has become smaller and smaller and smaller. Take, for example, in the time of the Cuban Missile Crisis.
Good evening, my fellow citizens. This government, as promised, has maintained the closest surveillance of the Soviet military buildup on the island of Cuba. Within the past week, unmistakable evidence has established the fact that a series of offensive missile sites is now in preparation on that imprisoned island. The purpose of these bases can be none other than to provide a nuclear strike capability against the Western Hemisphere. Upon receiving the first preliminary hard information of this nature last Tuesday morning at 9 a.m., I directed that our surveillance be stepped up. And having now confirmed and completed our evaluation of the evidence and our decision on a course of action, this government feels obliged to report this new crisis to you in fullest detail. The characteristic of these new missile sites indicate two distinct types of installations. Several of them include medium-range ballistic missiles capable of carrying a nuclear warhead for a distance of more than 1,000 nautical miles. Each of these missiles, in short, is capable of striking Washington, D.C., the Panama Canal, Cape Canaveral, Mexico City, or any other city in the southeastern part of the United States, in Central America, or in the Caribbean area.
President Kennedy didn't summon the National Security Council, the body that exists in statute that's supposed to advise him. What he did was he created an informal group called the XCOM, people he trusted, to advise him on how to deal with the Cuban Missile Crisis. Because frankly, he didn't trust the formal apparatus. So he wanted to get his own people.
Excuse me. He had realized how stupid they were because of the Bay of Pigs.
Yes. Go to the 1970s, and I suggest in the book, in a way, in the 1970s, at the time of the Nixon administration, we almost have an XCOM of two. We got Nixon and Kissinger. They're the two people making all the key decisions. Basically, they're making them as a result of conversations they're having with one another, and the formal apparatus is completely cut out of the real business. Well, fast forward now to post 9/11, and this decision is made to invade Iraq, which is one of the most significant foreign policy decisions in the last 30, 40, 50 years. The truth is, we don't know how that was made. I mean, we don't know who met with President Bush, when, and who said what. There are some journalists who argue that there really never was a decision, that over a period of time, people in the inner circle came to understand that an invasion was necessary, and so without a decision being rendered, they all began to act as if a decision had been made.
Right.
We all know what the boss wants to do, even if the boss hasn't actually said what he wants us to do. And I find, first of all, I think it's just striking the way, even though we've got this enormous apparatus called the Pentagon, this enormous apparatus called the State Department, and there's thousands of bureaucrats, and they're passing papers around and sending memos and emails and the like, that the real business of government on the most important issues tends to get settled by 5 or 6 people sitting around a table somewhere in the White House. Yeah. And they decide, and we live with the consequences of the decision. I guess that would be okay if their decisions were good decisions. But the record says their decisions are lousy decisions. So why is that the way the apparatus of government works? It's puzzling. Although it's not puzzling. It's not puzzling if you would say, if you would posit that the real object of the exercise is to enable this small group of people to exercise power and to feel that they, unlike you and me, are in this privileged circle. They're in the know. So if it's about their egos, then I guess the system works pretty well from their point of view. If the object of the exercise is supposed to be to produce effective policy, then it seems to me the way business gets done leaves much to be desired.
What you're saying goes right back to one of the subjects we discussed at the beginning of the last hour, which is that these people are not against the imperial presidency. They want their party to win so that they can be part of this privileged group.
Exactly right.
and make the decisions that you and I and everybody else in this country has to live with and had no say in.
I mean, you and I are talking here right as President Obama is taking office. I'm sure I could dig up any number of quotes from Senator Clinton denouncing the abuses of power of President Bush, but she's not becoming Secretary of State so that she can hand authority back to the Congress. She's becoming Secretary of State because she, with her president, now wish to be able to exercise the prerogatives of the imperial presidency.
Yeah. Andy, one of the things that Obama has repeatedly said is that he's going, I'll put this in loose terms, this is not formally correct. Boy, he's going to go all out. He's going to fight like the devil in Afghanistan. We're going to have more troops. What's your view? A, how should that decision be made one way or the other, apropos of what you've just been talking about? And B, what do you think is going to happen if we put 60 or 80,000 troops on the ground in Afghanistan?
Well, Obama made this commitment to send more U.S. troops to Afghanistan during the campaign. And I think the most obvious explanation for why he said that is because he wanted to deflect the charge of being a liberal Democrat who was weak on defense. I mean, he's running against the Iraq War policy. He needed to show that as an anti-Iraq war candidate, he wasn't an anti-war candidate, and therefore posturing with regard to reinforcing Afghanistan politically made sense. I would hope that now that he's president, he won't act on that campaign promise. If nobody's asking me my opinion, but I mean, nobody in Washington, but I mean, if anybody did, I would urge them to do a top-to-bottom scrub of our efforts in the global war on terror before making any rash decisions with regard to Afghanistan.
Scrub, you mean a review?
Yes.
Okay.
As you and I are talking, we're in the midst of this Israeli incursion into Gaza. And I've been thinking a lot about that, as many other people are, trying to figure out what to make of what's happening. Most of the discussion about the Israelis in Gaza, I think, really focuses on moral questions. Who's right and who's wrong here. And that kind of moral discussion generates more heat than light, I believe. I think there's another way to look at Gaza, and that is to consider Gaza as the latest chapter in a strategy undertaken by Israel to deal with the Palestinians. A strategy that began with the 1967 war when they occupied the West Bank and the Gaza Strip, a strategy that has denied the Palestinians the right to self-determination, a strategy in which the Israelis persuaded that Palestinian self-determination is incompatible with Israeli security. They have tried to dominate, pacify, control the Palestinians, and the result over 40 years now has been violence, uprisings, incursions, suicide bombers, tit-for-tat retaliation. The point is, 40 years into this proposition of trying to bring the Palestinians to heel, it hadn't worked. And I believe that there are important lessons in that failure for us. That in many respects, I think what President Bush set out to do after 9/11 was to bring the Islamic world to heel, to get them to conform to a set of norms that we think are necessary for our well-being and our security. And it ain't working. And if 40 years of trying by the Israelis vis-a-vis the Palestinians hasn't worked, 40 years of effort on our part on a much larger scale is not going to work. And therefore, I don't think it makes sense for us 7 years into our war in Afghanistan to imagine that the solution to that conflict lies in sending another 30 or 40,000 U.S. troops.
You know, Afghanistan, not only has the Taliban been regenerated, not only is it again the world's largest poppy growing, heroin growing area in the world, it has been the graveyard of empires since Alexander the Great.
Right.
Those people don't stop fighting.
Right.
And I think you're really suggesting, when you get right, you didn't explicitly say it, but I thought you were very clear. You're saying we'll be there for 40 years.
Oh, I think so.
And we'll still be in trouble.
Right.
Yeah.
And again, to go back to the triumphalist thinking of the post-Cold War era, when it seemed like we had an excess of power, excess of resources, we don't.
Yeah.
I mean, we've got an economy that's in the tank. We've got President Obama saying that we could well have trillion-dollar deficits for years.
Yeah.
We begin this year and this administration in the midst of an unprecedented crisis that calls for unprecedented action. Just this week, we saw more people file for unemployment than at any time in the last 26 years. And experts agree that if nothing is done, the unemployment rate could reach double digits. Our economy could fall $1 trillion short of its full capacity, which translates into more than $12,000 in lost income for a family of 4. And we could lose a generation of potential as more young Americans are forced to forego college dreams or the chance to train for the jobs of the future. In short, if we do not act boldly and swiftly, a bad situation could become dramatically worse. That is why I've proposed an American Recovery and Reinvestment Plan to immediately jumpstart job creation as well as long-term economic growth. I'm pleased to say that both parties in Congress are already hard at work on this plan, and I hope to sign it into law in less than a month. It's a plan that will save or create 3 to 4 million jobs over the next few years, and one that recognizes both the paradox and the promise of this moment. The fact that there are millions of Americans trying to find work, even as, all around the country, there's so much work to be done. That's why this is not just a short-term program to boost employment. It's one that will invest in our most important priorities, like energy and education, healthcare, and a new infrastructure that are necessary to keep us strong and competitive in the 21st century.
Yeah.
And to think that that kind of economic situation is compatible with a continued military effort in Afghanistan that could go on for decades strikes me as absurd. I mean, it's as if we're saying that, you know, on the one hand, our credit card's maxed out. On the other hand, even though I know I've been losing at the tables in Vegas, if I just, you know, just give me a couple more hours, Mama, and I'll be able to win it all back. It's just not likely to happen.
You haven't said this explicitly, but if one considers what you just said, I think it reduces to we are going to ruin our own country. Not to mention the, one hates even to say this, there could be various kinds, doesn't have to be military, of internal revolutions in this country. 40 years in Afghanistan, which could happen. I mean, a $1 trillion deficit, this is going to wreck the country.
You know, the Pentagon has what most of us refer to as the global war on terror. The Pentagon calls the long war. That's their preferred term for this conflict that began in 9/11. And they chose that term because, in essence, the adjective describes its most prominent feature. It's going to go on and on and on. Pentagon planners assume that the long war will last for decades. Yeah. Now again, if we had lots of money in the bank, maybe somehow or other it might make sense to sustain a war for decades. But when the bank account's empty, it can't make any sense. Now, I'm not trying to suggest, therefore, we sort of throw our hands up and say, I guess we should let the Islamists, you know, take over everything. What I am saying is that the strategy of the long war has not worked. It's unsatisfactory in terms of the results it's producing. The strategy of the long war is more than we can afford, and therefore it is incumbent upon us, and I think incumbent upon the Obama administration, to rethink strategy. I mean, to have an NSC 68 type exercise, but not one that's corrupted by offering 2 stupid courses of action and 1 plausible one, but an NSC type exercise that says, Mr. President, there are no good choices, because there are none, but here are 3 reasonable alternatives for us to debate and to consider, and for you to choose among.
Yeah. Andy, I want to ask you 2 last questions. The second one will go back to this. The first one is this. You make a point which I think is a point which every American should get into their heads. Every person in the world should get into their heads. And you say this. You point out that if there is one lesson to be learned above everything else, it is, quote, it is that war, quote, is sure to give rise to unexpected consequences. Only the truly demented will imagine otherwise. I think that has been true of every war I've ever heard or read about. And our people, speaking of rethinking what you're doing, I think guys like Wolfowitz, they were demented.
Well, see, this actually does, I think, connect back to this whole notion of the triumphalist thinking of the post-Cold War era. It wasn't triumphalist thinking that simply related to, who our standing in the world and the direction of history, but there was, in a sense, a subtext, which was that the United States had figured out war.
Yeah.
And that advanced technology, information technology, which we thought we kind of had a lock on, was making war as never before an effective instrument to achieve political purposes. I mean, people looked at Operation Desert Storm back in 1991. That's what they saw. And it's that sort of thinking that informed the expectations of people like Rumsfeld and Wolfowitz and the president when we invaded Iraq in 2003. It was supposed to be a short war. It was supposed to be a cheap war. It was supposed to be a decisive war. And I guess if you stopped the clock on May 1st, 2003, that's what you had, but unfortunately the clock didn't stop. And what we've ended up with is a very long war, a very costly war, a very indecisive war, and anybody with any understanding of history would say, yes, of course. It was the delusions that had risen up in the late 1980s and 1990s that caused people to forget those lessons of history, that war does give rise to unintended consequences. It is sloppy, it is unpredictable, it is fraught with chance. I would hope that, frankly, the one good thing that might come out of the last half dozen years is that decision makers would have been reminded of how war is unpredictable.
Well, one of the great problems in the United States is people in this country don't care a whit about history, not a whit. And they also don't understand. I remember saying this in a book I wrote 4 years ago. I didn't know that the weapon would be IEDs, but you just knew that the whole history of warfare is somebody gets an advantage in weaponry or tactics. Right. Hey, the other guy figures out a way to defeat that.
Right.
Yeah, and it's always been the way, back and forth. To think you have figured out war, and there won't be contingencies, and the iron law of unexpected consequences won't operate, this is just dementia of some type, if you ask me.
Well, see, they assume, again, it's inexplicable, but they assume that the adversary would fight the way we want the adversary to fight. Now, frankly, if your adversary is Saddam Hussein, he's probably going to do that.
Yeah.
But not every adversary is as stupid as Saddam Hussein.
The British used to say in the Revolution, the Americans won't fight like gentlemen.
Right.
They won't stand up their lines where we can bayonet them.
Of course, exactly.
Gee. Last question. You suggest containment and deterrence as an alternative to what we're doing. An idea with a long history. It actually goes back to the famous long telegram of X, who was George Kennan,
Right.
in 1947,
Yep.
where he set out in this huge long telegram the strategy of containment against the Soviet Union.
Right.
How would you apply containment and deterrence vis-a-vis what we are facing in the fundamentalist portions of the Middle East?
Yeah, and you're right. The word containment conjures up Cold War, conjures up doing things like Marshall Plan or NATO, and that's not what I mean. But here's what I would say. In order to formulate a sound strategy, we need to realistically appraise the threat. And I would appraise the threat in two components. First, the more dangerous, or the component posing the more immediate danger, would be organizations like Al Qaeda. I mean, these are people who want to kill us. But frankly, they are not nearly as capable as they have been portrayed by the Bush administration. I mean, 9/11 happened not because they were so smart, but because we were so stupid and let our guard down. Nonetheless, they are a danger, and that danger needs to be addressed. It should be addressed not by invading and occupying countries, which is what we've been trying to do. It should be addressed by seeing the threat as an international criminal conspiracy requiring an international police effort to root it out and destroy it. All right? Take a long time, considerable resources, but a more effective, I think, approach than the one we have pursued in Iraq and Afghanistan. The second threat, although maybe I'd put threat in quotes here, is the more amorphous problem of the dysfunction which exists to a considerable extent in the Islamic world. And I don't mean to portray myself as an expert on Islam, but it seems to me that in many respects the dysfunction is that societies in the Islamic world have not yet found the way to reconcile Islam with modernity. We in the West struggled with ways to reconcile our predominant religious tradition, Christianity, with modernity. That process was a bloody one, and it took a long time to sort itself out. I think that, speaking in very broad terms, Muslims have to undergo a similar process, and we can't make them come to that reconciliation. They have to sort out themselves. What will it mean to be a Muslim in a world of modernity? In the meantime, the best we can do is to prevent that internal argument from expressing itself in ways that do us harm. And that's where I think we get to containment. But it's not containment like build a NATO. It's containment meaning to ensure that people who come from that world don't come bearing bombs. It's a matter simply of monitoring and controlling the movement of people. It's a matter of not providing enormous sums of money to fund Islamist activity. I mean, our dependence on oil, which sends billions and billions and billions of dollars to Saudi Arabia, with the Saudis, to some degree, using that money to fund Islamic fundamentalist activity, to have an energy policy so we don't give them the money to underwrite activities intended to harm us. And I think that sort of approach over time will allow the Muslims to sort out their own problems. And we're talking a 100-year proposition here. Yeah. I'm not trying to make it sound like it's simple. It's a long piece. It'd be nice if we could have a long piece.
Yeah. Well, Andy, I want to thank you for sitting for the portion of a second hour. To the audience, I cannot stress enough that I think, and we haven't even touched on everything that Andy's written, and that in a sense is my fault, but I felt that what he has to say is in so many respects so important that I didn't want to rush through things. So I strongly urge you to read the book, and I only wish that the policymakers in Washington would give consideration to the ideas being presented by Professor Bacevich. Now let me say that since we are breaking off this interview in the middle of the hour, the rest of the hour will consist of excerpts from a number of our other programs, book shows, and other shows And the subjects of the experts, of the excerpts, as were, because the shows were on this subject, will be various kinds of sports figures, various kinds of sports teams, various aspects of American sports in the last, well, depending on which shows I'm talking about, it could be as far back as, let us say, 1938, with the great Yankee team of that year, or it could be as modern as some of the things that women are doing in sports within the last year or two. So stay tuned, stay with the program. We'll be showing you some excerpts from various of our programs on sports. Thank you for being with us, and be with us again next time. And Andy, thank you.
Thank you very much.
Appreciate it. Why did you write a book about that team, and in particular the three pitchers, Allie Reynolds, Vic Raschi, and Eddie Lopat?
Yeah, I also teach courses in American immigrant history, American immigrant literature, and I'm also now well into my 70s. So my childhood was coming back to me much more strongly than I thought it ever would. And these were the three heroes of my childhood. The Yankee teams of 49 to 53, winning 5 consecutive World Championships. It was like being on the board of General Motors. Every year I was the winner. Think of the Red Sox fans for the 86 years before they finally won it in 2004. Every year, for 5 years, the Yankees won the World Series. It was a wonderful fall and summer, and then fall and winter. And so this stayed with me all my life, and the three pitchers were just my heroes. And finally, when I got to be of an age, and I realized also that I had an opportunity to teach American baseball history at Tufts, I did that, and I said, I want to write about them.
Yep.
And that was the itch that started me.
Yep. Now, you have said previously, privately to me, and to others, that the Red Sox, who lost for 86 years, deserve to lose. I think your reason is sufficiently important. Why do you, that I'm going to ask you, why do you feel that way?
Well, from the time that up until Tom Yorkie, they just didn't have any resources. When Tom Yorkie took the team over in the early 1930s, they had all the opportunity in the world to buy whatever they wanted. Tom Yorkie had a gift for finding mediocre managers, mediocre general managers. When they really came back after World War II, they had everybody. They had Williams, DiMaggio, Dorr, Pesky. They bought from the St. Louis Browns Ellis Kinder, Vern Stevens. They had the greatest potential team in the history, but they were a racist team. They had a chance to sign Jackie Robinson in 1945 and didn't. They had a chance to sign Willie Mays in 1946 and they didn't. And they simply blew it. And with the likes of people like Pinky Higgins and Billy Jurgis and Tom Yorkie and Joe Cronin, they were not going to make the moves that they had to make. Now, the Yankees were just as racist, but George Weiss, the general manager, was smarter. He took a look around, he understood the Negro Leagues, and he knew that if the blacks were going to come into the major leagues, they were going to change the game. And George Weiss gave his scouts instructions, said, find me a white ball player who plays black. Now, what did that mean? It meant somebody who had the 5 great skills, who could hit with power, run, throw, and play defense. The idea of running and hitting with power was unknown in the major leagues. And when Jackie Robinson came up in 47 and led the major leagues in stolen bases with 29 and led the Dodgers in home runs, only 12, but led the Dodgers in home runs, that revolutionized the game. And Weiss knew it. And the Yankee scouts went out and they found their equivalent of Larry Doby, their equivalent of Monty Irvin, and the equivalent of Jackie and Willie Mays, a white man from Oklahoma, young boy who ran like the wind and hit with power from the left side and the right side, Mickey Mantle.
You read like mad to teach yourself how to write. Describe what you did.
Once I realized that I really wanted to be a writer I would say in the mid 60s, 65, 66, I started to read. There was no writing courses. I mean, it wasn't like I can go to Fair for You and take a creative writing course. No such thing existed. And so and plus I was working and married and all that. So I began to read everything. I subscribed to every magazine from Saturday Review to New Yorker, Atlantic, Harper's, everything. Read everything, read every book that came out, and read as if it was a course that I was taking on writing. I never read for enjoyment. I read, if a review said that so-and-so was a master of dialogue, I would get the book and I would study the dialogue and figure out why was he a master. What was, I figured it out myself. Right. I didn't have anybody teaching me. Somebody was a master of description, I would buy the book only to see what they were doing. And I guess I taught myself. And I would work at home, correct papers after I put my kids to sleep, and then about 10 o'clock at night I'd go up into an attic room and I'd write little snippets of stuff. Like I would set up a course for my own self. I'd say, all right, today I'm going to do description. What am I going to describe? And I would describe something in 2 or 3 paragraphs. And then a couple of days later I'd do narration. Then I'd do dialogue.
You talk about Rick and Keel. And I'd like to read something that you wrote, the last 14 lines on page 434. You were describing a talk you had with Ann Keel. And here's what was said back and forth. You got to get back on the mound. You should always be throwing from the mound. I know, he says, soon. It's no big thing, I say. You've been throwing off a mound ever since you were a kid. Just don't think about it. You've got to force yourself not to think about your motion, or it will mess you up. He looks down at the sidewalk and nods. Just remember, I say, the mound is where you live. He looks up and smiles. How do you know, he says. Why do you think I'm here? What's happening to you happened to me in 1961. I forgot how to pitch. I've been thinking about it ever since. What did you learn, he asks. Not to think. So, well, Pat, that's a fabulous piece of writing.
What I say, you don't think, I don't mean you don't think about the batter and curveball and slider. I mean, when your natural physical ability that you've been doing all your life, once you start thinking about it and analyzing it and getting so convoluted about it, you're on the pitcher's mound, for example, and you're thinking, well, I'll put my foot on the rubber, I'll do this, I'll do that, and you lose sight of the simple aspect of throwing the ball. It's possible that I could have thought my way through that, which I did, because I wrote a book 30 years later when I was 56 called A Nice Tuesday, in which I pitched another minor league game. And I was 56 years old, I pitched in Waterbury, Connecticut, and I thought my way through that bad spell I had when I was 21. Took a long time. I'm not that bright. Took me until I was 56, so 35 years. I threw beautifully in that Waterbury game when I was 56. Throwing the ball 85, 86 miles an hour, good slider, got everybody out, and I had thought my way. Now, it was possible I could have done that when I was 21, but I wasn't equipped to do it. Think my way out of that trough.
Why weren't you equipped to do that then?
I was too panicky on the result. I wasn't interested in the process as much as the result. In other words, instead of thinking, all right, now what's going on here, why this, I said, I gotta hurry up, I gotta be in AAA this year.
Jeremy, what drew you to write about Jesse Owens' triumph at the 1936 Olympics?
Well, the things you said, really. I mean, it is a layered story. There's a lot there. As magnificent as Jesse Owens' achievements athletically were at those games, when you consider the backdrop against which they were achieved, the political situation in Germany, an ascendant Third Reich, the fact that at the same time Jesse Owens was consigned to second-class citizen status here in the United States, I thought there were a lot of issues that were worth exploring and that haven't been explored in a long time. And certainly, I think it's fair to say that this is the first book, 71 years after Owens won those 4 gold medals in Berlin, that focuses on his achievement at the Olympics and the political and social context.
Do you look for that in your writing? Because in Cinderella Man, it also went well beyond just the fight in the arena and everything else. And as you said, the Triumph actually is much more about history and its historical, the event in its historical context than simply just someone running a race.
Well, the backdrop for Cinderella Man is really the Great Depression. That's the defining story behind Jim Braddock's quest for the heavyweight title. This is only a year later, and we're still in the middle of the Great Depression, but that's not what is uppermost in the story for Jesse Owens, who's only 22 years old at the time, hasn't suffered through the Depression the way Braddock did. But yes, I'm looking for something that's more than just a sports story. There are great sports stories, but it's hard to build, I think, a compelling 300, 400-page narrative about specifically what Jesse Owens did just on the track, as amazing as it was, and the records that he set before the Olympics, the performance at the Games in Berlin. But what interested me were all of the other figures and all of the other currents running through the story.
The early part of Jesse Owens' collegiate career, you wrote about in the book.
He establishes a record of achievement that is unprecedented and unmatched since then. Specifically at the Big Ten Championships, 1935, on May 25th, 1935 at Ann Arbor, Owens, in the span of fewer than 60 minutes, it could have been 50 minutes, 45 minutes, nobody is quite sure, nobody had a watch on it, he sets 5 world records and equals another. Now, people who really know sports history, people who know this stuff better than I do, will tell you that what he did on May 25th, 1935 remains the most spectacular single-day achievement in the history of sports. And he did that in college, so it's kind of hard to argue that anybody has ever lived up to that.
And some of those world records held for quite a period of time after that.
Oh, yeah, remarkably durable records, particularly the broad jump record, what we now call the long jump. Owens broke the world record that day by half a foot. He jumped 26 feet, 8 1/4 inches, and that record stood until 1959. The dash records were not quite as durable, but lasted for a while. And he would set other records that would last a very long time. The thing that's most remarkable about how enduring those records were, I wanted to see for myself, just how great was that, because 26, 8 1/4 inches is still a very respectable long jump 71 years later. At the 2004 Olympics in Athens, it would have given him 9th place. Okay, I mean, we're talking about 71 years later with training, with goals being set at different levels, with equipment, with rubberized tracks, with nutrition, with weight training, and he still would have been in the running.
The track back in the 1930s was, as you described it, the sport of the masses. What happened? Why is it relegated to so far down the list these days?
Track really is, for the most part, for most American sports fans, irrelevant now. At the Olympics, there's obviously some interest. Every 4 years, people get excited, perhaps, about a Carl Lewis or a Michael Johnson, but in much the same way that harness racing was one of the most popular sports, if not the most popular sport in the country at the turn of the 20th century, track and field was that big up until really the 50s, I would say. One example, 1950, when the Associated Press conducted a poll of 393 sports writers, its comprehensive half-century poll, greatest athlete, et cetera, 6 of the top 18 greatest athletes, according to this poll, were track stars. Now, if you did that from 1950 to 2000, I'd be surprised if you got more than one track guy on that list, and that would probably be Carl Lewis. I think what happened, it's not a great TV sport. You have to be there and kind of soak it up for hours and see several events at once, which you can't really get a feel for that on TV. And beyond that, it really is linked, I think, in a lot of ways to our rural roots, like harness racing. When people had horses and would go from town to town in buggies, when there weren't basketball courts everywhere, and there weren't football fields, and sports weren't as hyper-organized as they are now, it was natural people ran and jumped and threw heavy things. and so people had a greater interest in track and field. It was closer to them. You know, it's just one of those cyclical things, and I don't think it'll ever be back to what it was, not here.
As 1936 approached, Jesse Owens was clearly the favorite. He was the fastest man in the world at that point. He had to go into Germany and face enormous pressure under the most trying circumstances possible. What type of athlete, what type of man could face that type of pressure and nonetheless, with all of the pressure on him, really achieve such great success?
He had to be remarkably confident, and he was, but not overconfident. He worked hard, he took care of himself. He did everything he could to assure that there wouldn't be some last-minute injury that might sabotage his chances, as it had one of his great rivals, Ulysses Peacock. He was, of course, just very good at what he did. He should have won all those events because he was the best in the world at them. It wasn't an upset. I mean, this is a slight digression, but for instance, Al Order, who's one of the greatest track stars ever, won 4 consecutive gold medals in the discus. Each time that he won the gold medal, 4 consecutive Olympics, he was the underdog competing against the world record holder. That wasn't the case with Jesse Owens, but there were so many things that could have happened. A long boat ride, unfamiliar food, unfamiliar surroundings, some kind of injury, although some people thought that injuries helped him focus. What was required of him was an ability to focus. He did that remarkably well. He was not at all, he was unflappable, basically. With 100,000 people screaming at the stadium, with Hitler glaring down at him, with his rivals lined up right next to him, he performed remarkably well. Not only in the finals, we know he won the 4 gold medals, but in the heats, he set record after record. In the qualifying rounds, he set record after record. He did not have a bad moment at the Olympics, with the exception of his second qualifying jump in the broad jump.
Are there any comparable performances by a different athlete under such incredible pressure that you're aware of?
There was so much pressure on Jesse Owens because so much was at stake for him personally. This was his one shot to be a star. He knew that. He had a family to support already. He knew as a black man coming back to the U.S. in 1936, there wouldn't be the same opportunities for him that there would be for his white teammates. He knew he had to win the gold medals basically to assure his future. And then there's all the external pressure. There's the pressure of competing against Germany for the United States. There's the pressure of competing as a black man in a white-dominated society, trying to prove something there. I think the only thing comparable, really, and we mentioned him before, is Jackie Robinson and what he had to do in 1947. And of course, that's over the course of 7 months as opposed to 10 days in Berlin. But in the sense that they both knew how much was at stake and what a great impact their deeds would have, I would compare Robinson and Owens. Carl Lewis won the same 4 events in 1984 in Los Angeles and did it spectacularly, and is, you know, if you consider the totality of his track career, probably the greatest track athlete ever. But he wasn't performing under these kinds of pressures, and he was at home.
He really was one of the most dignified and graceful athletes ever.
Oh, he was. He was beautiful to watch. He had this remarkable style where it seemed that he was barely touching the track. He had no vanity in his style. He never looked at the other runners. He never strained. He ran in an entirely kind of upright position. He was beautiful to watch. He was physically beautiful. He was this, you know, he had these remarkable legs, and that's the one word that people use more often than anything else to describe both his running style and his physique. Beautiful.
Thanks, Jeremy. Thanks for joining us. Thank you.